Well, good evening. I'd like to welcome you to our community here at Ohio Valley University. We're honored that you're with us tonight. I know some people are still coming in. I know many of you are standing, but we're still delighted that you're here. You're invited to come to our campus at any time. In fact, every day at 11 o'clock in this room, Robert's Chapel, we have a worship service, and Monday through Friday, you're always invited to come and be our guest. My name is Harold Shank, and I'm the president of the university. Well, events like this involve many people to put them on in a fine way. There are several groups that provided funding for Mrs. Lazan's visit here to the Mid-Ohio Valley, including the McDonough Foundation, and there are others. And so we're very grateful to all those organizations for help fund the evening. And several people have been involved in coordinating Mrs. Lazan's visit to our area. The staff and families at Jackson Middle School in Vienna provided transportation for Nathaniel and Marion in their visit here. The PM Company and the Wingate Hotel have provided complimentary nights at deluxe accommodations, and we're grateful to them for that. So why don't we recognize all those groups for There are a couple of people I'd like to mention, especially Mrs. Betsy Utt is a 6th grade language arts teacher at Jackson Middle School. And this past summer, she read Mrs. Lazan's book for Perfect Pebbles, and she thought this would be a wonderful author and person to come and visit us in our beautiful area. And so she made the contact, and because of her work with students and with Mrs. Lazan, the students at Jackson Middle School and Hamilton Middle School and Belcree schools have enjoyed during the day this week hearing Mrs. Lazan. So we thank Mrs. Utt for her desire to give the community a chance to hear Mrs. Lazan tonight. And she was assisted by Shannon Farabee, who's a 6th grade social studies teacher at Jackson Middle School. And so we owe both of those women and people around them appreciation for the work. And I'd like them to stand and be recognized. One of them's right here. There they are. Recognized as fine men. And then Dr. Steve Hardy is Dean of our College of Arts and Sciences, and he's played a key role here at the university in making all this happen. I have no idea where he is. Steve, are you? He's in the hallway. Let's just give him a word of appreciation. I have a dear friend who's now passed away, Stanley Shipp, and he had a profound influence on my life. And one day in a mentoring session, he said to me that no matter what kind of audience you stand in front of, or what kind of people you're sitting in the midst of, there's one thing that we all have in common, and that is we're all looking for hope. We're all looking for a reason to get up, a reason to go on, a reason to live another day. And so when we hear of someone like Mrs. Marion Blumenthal Lazan, who hoped in the most desperate of situations, it builds our own hope, it increases our optimism, and it gives us reason to go on. And so we find hope in the courage of others. And tonight, we all see and witness courage firsthand. And we find hope in seeing others being compassionate. And we will understand compassion at a deeper level through the life that was lived in a difficult time. Ms. Lazan survived the Holocaust. She lived a life of courage. She lived a life of compassion. And so we welcome you, Mrs. Lazan, and we honor you for the hope you bring on us.
Dr. Shank, thank you so much for your meaningful and kind introduction. I thank you and Mr. Hardy, Steve Hardy, for making the arrangements for our visit here this evening. And I too want once again thank my dear friend Betsy Ite for coordinating this week's visit. And is Belinda here from the Wingate Inn? She was supposed to be here. Anyway, we want to thank the Wingate Inn again for donating our stay here this week. This evening I'm here to share my story with you. It is my childhood experiences during World War II in the concentration camps. I will tell you about our liberation and how we finally started our lives anew in our blessed United States of America. Mine is a story that Anne Frank might have told had she survived. And as most of you know, I think all of you know, Anne Frank was a young Jewish girl who died along with most of her family in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II. This is also a story that conveys a message of perseverance, determination, faith, and above all, hope. After the presentation, I'm not sure whether this is going to work, but I'll try to answer some of your questions. Life in the early 1930s in Germany was very much for my family as it is here for most of you today. Never did we think that the anti-Semitic incidents there would ever lead to very much. My father was in a successful shoe business in a small town. My parents, 2-year older brother and I lived comfortably with my grandparents above the shoe store. Life for Jews was made increasingly more difficult, and in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were formulated and enforced. The following are just some of the many restrictions imposed on the Jews in Germany. Jews were not allowed into theaters, into parks, or into swimming pools. All public schools were closed to Jewish children. Then there was the evening curfew for the Jews. Jews were only allowed to shop during specific hours of the day, and non-Jews were not allowed to shop in Jewish-owned stores. Non-Jews were just not allowed to associate with Jewish people. And then a big letter J for Jew was stamped on ID cards and on passports. These restrictions went on and on. And it was then that my parents decided to make arrangements to leave the country. My grandparents, who were in the late 70s and ill, refused to leave their home. They could not understand the urgency or the necessity of doing so. My grandparents passed away in 1938, just 11 days within each other. And soon thereafter, we received our necessary papers for our immigration to America. I was just 4 years old at that time. November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night. It was the night of broken glass, when the Nazis and their many followers smashed the windows and the storefronts of Jewish-owned stores. Jewish establishments, synagogues, and Jewish books were burned and destroyed. This was the beginning of a massive pogrom against the Jews in Germany, a massive verbal and physical assault against all German Jews. In reality, this was the beginning of the Holocaust. On November 12th, following Kristallnacht, the German government actually fined the Jewish population for the damage caused that night. These imposed taxes were used to rearm Germany. The night of Kristallnacht, my father was taken away from our home, and unbeknownst to my mother, was sent to concentration camp Buchenwald in Germany. All sorts of terrible stories were related to my mother, and we did not know if we would ever see my father again. He was released after 10 days, only because our papers were in order for our immigration to America. And to think that just a few years prior, he had been awarded the Iron Cross for his military service in the German army of World War I. We were forced to sell both our home and our business for a fraction of its worth. And soon thereafter, in January of 1939, we left for Holland, from where we were to sail to the United States. And for almost 9 months, while awaiting our quota number from the American State Department, my parents were assigned to take care of some 125 children. These young children had been sent by their parents from various parts of Europe to escape from the Nazis. In December of that year, 1939, we were deported to the detention camp of Westerbork in Holland to await our departure day to America. Camp Westerbork was constructed by the Dutch to accommodate Jews from various parts of Europe. In May of 1940, just 1 month before our planned departure day, the Germans invaded Holland and we were trapped. All of our belongings, which were about to be loaded on board ship, were burned and destroyed as the harbor of Rotterdam was bombed. Under Dutch control, Camp Westerbork was tolerable. My mother, father, brother, and I shared 2 small rooms. We all ate in a communal dining room, and at that time there was enough food for us so that we did not go hungry. Adults were assigned to various work duties. My father worked to repair shoes. My mother worked in the kitchen. We children had a makeshift education and lived a very dull, stagnant life. Several months later, when the Nazi SS took over the command of Westerbork, we became acquainted with the ever-present, terrifying 12-foot-high barbed wire. And as thousands of Jews were rounded up, many taken from their hiding places, as was Anne Frank and her family, Camp Westerbork became overcrowded, and it was at that time that we had to share our small quarters with another family. And then the dreadful transports to the concentration and extermination camps in Eastern Europe began. This started in early 1942, and from then on, almost every Tuesday morning, men, women, and little ones were marched to a nearby railroad platform from where they were transported. This area became known as Boulevard de Misère. It was an area of complete misery. In January of 1944, it was our turn to be shipped out. We children were actually glad for a change of environment. We were very naive, and we welcomed the move. We were allowed to take 1 knapsack each, and whatever we could stuff into it, we were permitted to take. When we approached the railroad platform and saw the cattle cars in which we were to travel, we realized that when we saw the cattle cars and our fears began to mount at that point. And adults suspected and somehow knew what was in store for us. I remember that it was a bitter cold, pitch black, rainy night when we arrived at our destination, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany. We were pulled and dragged out of the cattle cars and greeted by the German guards who were shouting at us and threatening us with their rifles and with the most vicious attack dogs by their sides. I was a very frightened 9-year-old. And to this day, I still feel a certain sense of fear whenever I see a German shepherd. Bergen-Belsen was divided into various areas. It was sectioned off and surrounded by electrified barbed wire. Guards were always in strategically placed high guard towers, and in the evening, as soon as it would turn dark, the bright searchlights from above would constantly sweep the campgrounds. We were placed in a section that was known as the Sternlager, or the Star Camp, named so because we had to continue wearing that yellow star which had been issued to us back in Holland. Men were on one side of the camp and the women on the other. And this did make it possible at times for families to get a glimpse of one another. 600 of us, 600 of our people were crammed into each of the crude, wooden, heatless barracks meant for 100 when originally built. There were triple-decker bunk beds with 2 people sharing each bunk. The German winters were bitter cold and very long. We were given only one thin blanket per bunk and a straw-filled mattress, and this bunk was our only living quarters, and that for 2 people. I was very lucky that I was able to share a bunk with my mother, and that my brother was able to share a bunk with our father. But can you imagine 2 adults, 2 strangers, sharing a bunk under such horrendous conditions? A bunk that was no larger than the small cut bed that we're all so familiar with. I remember the first time seeing a wagon filled with what I thought was firewood for the one small oven that we had in our barrack. That oven, of course, was never used. I soon realized that what was in the wagon were dead, naked bodies thrown one on top of the other. Toilets and so-called washing facilities were at a great distance in the most primitive outhouses. Toilets were long wooden benches with holes cut into them, one next to the other. There was no privacy. There was no toilet paper. There was no soap, and hardly ever any water with which to wash. And in the almost year and a half that we were in Bergen-Belsen, never once were we able to brush our teeth. There were no trees, no flowers, nor did we ever see a blade of grass. And whenever it rained, we had to slush through the mud, adding even more misery to our already dismal existence. Every morning, every single morning, without fail, we were ordered to line up on a huge field. It was called an Appellplatz, 5 in a row as we were counted. We would have to stand there until each and every one of us was accounted for, often from early morning till late at night, without food, without water, no matter what the weather, without protective clothing. Frostbite was common. We would treat our affected toes and fingers with the warmth of our own urine. Our diet consisted of a slice of bread a day, pat of butter, some hot watery soup with grizzly meats and turnips and potato peel. The bread was later cut back and given to us just once a week, and only if our so-called quarters were neat and in order. Our birthday present to one another was that little piece of bread that we had saved up from the previous week. Once a month, we were marched to an area to shower, and there, under the watchful eyes of the guards, we were ordered to undress. We had heard about exterminations and gas chambers in other areas of Europe, and we therefore were never sure when the faucets were turned on as to what would come out, water or gas. The Nazis did their utmost to break us physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Unfortunately, they did succeed with many of our people. It was not uncommon for people who were no longer responsible for their actions to attempt escape, even though they knew that the chance to succeed was next to impossible. But they also felt that they had nothing more to lose. The failure of their attempts were obvious when we saw their lifeless bodies hanging electrocuted against the barbed wire. Malnutrition, dysentery, and the loss of the will to go on is what destroyed body and mind. Death was an everyday occurrence. The dark, crowded quarters often caused us to trip and fall over the dead. Bodies could not be taken away fast enough. We as children saw things that no one, no matter what the age, should ever have to see. I know, of course, that you have all heard, you have read, the students here have studied, many of you have seen movies, perhaps even true documentaries about the Holocaust. But the constant foul odor, the filth, continuous horror and fear surrounded by death is indescribable. There is no way that this can be put accurately into words or pictures. Our bodies, hair, and clothes were infested with lice. We learned that there was a distinct difference between head lice and clothes lice. Squashing them between my thumbnails became my primary pastime. Much of my time was taken up with make-believe games. And one game, a game based on superstition, became very important to me. I decided that if I were to find 4 pebbles of about the same size and shape, that would mean that the 4 members of my family would all survive. My mother, my father, my brother, and I. It was a torturous, painful, very difficult game to play. What if I couldn't find that 3rd or 4th pebble? Might that mean that 1 or 2 of my family members would not pull through? Nevertheless, this game gave me something to hold on to, some distant hope. After a number of months on our meager diets, our stomach shrunk so that the hunger was no longer painful. Teenagers and men suffered most from malnutrition and were the first to die. Those who lasted the longest were the women, and mothers in particular. It was their strong will to keep their children alive that kept them going. And my mother was one of those remarkable ladies. There is no doubt in my mind that it was my mother's inner strength and fortitude that finally saw us through. One day, my mother was able to smuggle some potatoes and some salt from the kitchen where she worked. Using an empty can as a pot and pieces from the wooden slats from our bunk as firewood, my mother somehow managed to cook some soup in secret. This was done on our bunk. I was on the bunk with her, trying to hide and shield what she was doing. Soup was simmering and just about finished when the German guards entered our barrack for a surprise inspection. And in our rush to hide that setup, the boiling soup spilled on my leg. We had been taught self-discipline and self-control the hard way, for I knew for sure that if I had cried out, it would have cost us our lives. This happened in the spring of 1945. I was just 10 years old. The population in Camp Bergen-Belsen was dying off rapidly, but not nearly fast enough to satisfy the Nazis. Several weeks later, it was decided to send 3 trainloads of our people to Eastern Europe, towards the extermination camps and the gas chambers. My family was among the 2,500 on the last of these 3 trains. It was April of 1945. The Russian army was closing in from the northeast, and the British and the Americans from the west. Under normal conditions, this train ride from Bergen-Belsen to whatever area of Eastern Europe they were to send us would have taken no more than 10 hours. But because the Germans tried to evade the Allies, we were en route for 2 long weeks, without food, without water, without medical supplies, without sanitary facilities, no toilets. Whenever the train came to a stop, those who were able and those who were strong enough were permitted to get out and take a drink from a nearby stream or dig up roots to eat. My mother remembered taking some sort of a pot and collecting water from the locomotive. And who knows what else the pot was used for. The need for water at that time was almost more important than food because of the severe dehydration due to the dysentery and the high fever due to the typhus. Let me briefly explain typhus. It is a highly contagious, deadly disease that's caused from filth and spread by lice. At the same time, while the train was at a standstill, the newly dead were taken off. and buried along the tracks. In addition, our train was subject to frequent air attacks by the Allies. It is truly remarkable how any one of us was able to survive under such horrendous conditions. In fact, 500 of our people, that's 1 out of every 5, died en route or shortly thereafter. My burnt leg was severely infected, and it was impossible to keep the wound clean or lice-free. In late April, after 14 days of this surreal and horrifying journey, the German guards stormed frantically through the train, demanding civilian clothing so that they would not be recognized by the Allies. And we knew then that the war was coming to an end. It was the Russian army that liberated our train and led us to a nearby farm village in eastern Germany. Most of the inhabitants had fled, and we took over their homes. Kitchens were stocked with ample food. It was rich and good, actually much too good for our starved bodies. We could not tolerate that unfamiliar nourishment. And at that time, at the age of 10 and a half, I weighed 16 kilos, or as we know it here, 35 pounds. And my mother weighed a mere 60 pounds. The Russians, in their crude way, tried to help us the best that they could. I was brought to a nearby clinic for medical attention. My leg was in very bad condition, and I was close to losing it. Fortunately, it was decided to treat the wound, and I was very lucky that my leg responded to medication, and it gradually healed. As I regained my strength, I also learned to walk, and in the interim, our heads were shaved, because that was the only way that we could rid ourselves of head lice. Although we were all weak, ill, and thoroughly exhausted, I vividly remember the spring of 1945. The weather was beautiful, sunny and bright. Trees and grass were lush and green. The flowers were in bloom, the birds were singing. It was a wonderful, exciting feeling to be free at long last. We were all ill with typhus, but my father had to die from it 6 weeks after our liberation. And this after 6.5 years of mental torment and physical abuse. My 12-year-old brother Albert actually helped bury our father. When I talk about those years, it is as though I'm relating a nightmare, a very bad dream. I separate myself from it ever having happened to me, and that is how I deal with it. It is a wonderful story how we gradually recuperated and were sent back to Holland to start our lives anew. My brother and I were eventually placed in a children's home in preparation to live in what was then still Palestine, and we know today as Israel. Most of the children in this home survived alone without their parents. I felt like a total misfit. I needed to learn how to be settled into a normal society. Had no training for that. Here I was by this time, 11 years old, had never been in a store, had no idea what money was all about. I had almost no table manners. It was like learning to live all over again. It was in this home that we became reacquainted with life in its normal state. The meals served us were delicious and nourishing. And you can imagine that just about anything and everything tasted good to us. And though our surrogate parents provided a very strict environment, much love and care were given us. I began my first formal education at that time at the age of 11 and a half. We were taught the secular subjects, reading, writing, arithmetic, in a Montessori school where we progressed at our own pace. The Dutch language in which we were taught was all new to us. We also received a thorough education in Hebrew and in religious studies. The British, who were governing Palestine in the 1940s, had imposed a quoted number of Jews permitted into the land, and they were intercepting many of the refugee ships and interning the survivors on the island of Cyprus. And in some cases, they turned the ships back to Europe. In 1947, just 1 year prior to Israel becoming a state, our illegal voyage from Harlem to Palestine was planned, and danger once again loomed over us. And it was then that my mother managed to make arrangements for a family of 3 to emigrate to the United States. And thanks to the Holland America line, we were able to use the tickets which had been purchased 10 years earlier. We arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, April 23rd, 1948. By coincidence, exactly 3 years to the day of our liberation. It was a Jewish relief organization, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, that found a home for us in Peoria, Illinois. Never heard of Illinois, certainly not Peoria. And there, at the age of 13, I once again started life anew in a strange land and again learning a new language. My 3rd new language in less than 3 years. First Dutch, then Hebrew, and now English. And because of my inability to speak English, I, at the age of 13, was placed in the 4th grade with 9-year-olds. Although both my brother and I worked long hours after school to help our mom pay bills, I nevertheless found time, I actually made time, to take extra courses during the year, attend summer school, and by working very hard in my studies, I was able to be graduated from Peoria Central High School 5 years later at age 18, ranking 8th in a class of 267 students. It was a lot of hard work, but it paid off. It was 2 months after high school graduation that I was married to Marion Lazan, who I had met at the age of 16 in Peoria. And we are so grateful to have celebrated our 60th wedding anniversary last year. Nathaniel, where are you? You were supposed to wait. You're supposed to wait so I can get my drink of water. I am grateful. I am very grateful that I survived healthy in body, mind, and spirit, and that together with my husband, I'm able to perpetuate my heritage with a wonderful family. We have 3 grown children, all 3 are happily married, and have given us 9 beautiful grandchildren and 2 extraordinary, amazing great-granddaughters. Remarkable, remarkable. And in March of 1996, my memoir, For Perfect Pebbles, co-authored by Lila Perl, was published by Green Willow Division of HarperCollins. It is now in its 25th printing in hardback, available in paperback by Avon and Scholastic Book Club, has been translated into German, into Dutch, and if you like, you may all read it in Japanese. Maybe there's someone here who can do just that. But above all, I am so grateful that the story is in book form so that it can be passed on to future generations. And I'm thrilled that a documentary has been made entitled Marion's Triumph, with the actress Deborah Messing as the narrator. It's been aired over PBS stations throughout the country the past several years, and we were just notified that it'll be back on PBS this coming April. So check it out. So you'll see that despite all the terrible things that happened to me as a child, my life today is full and rewarding. Before I answer some of your questions, I don't know, as I said, I'm not sure if that works, but I have a very important favor to ask of each and every one of you in this room, and I am so grateful that it is filled. Thank you all for being here. Although I have spoken to upwards of 1 million students and adults over these past 20-some years, it still has not become easy. However, I do realize the importance of sharing that period of our history with you, simply because in a few short years we will not be here any longer to give a first-hand account. Today's young generation is the last generation that will hear these stories firsthand. And I therefore ask you, the students here tonight, to please share my story or any of the Holocaust stories that you read and hear about. Share them with your friends, share them with your relatives, and someday share them with your children. And yes, even with your grandchildren. When we're not here any longer, it is you who will have to bear witness. As difficult as it is, the horror of the Holocaust must be taught, must be studied, and kept alive. Only then can we guard it from ever happening again. This is the very yellow star that I was forced to wear. It says Jude, which in German means Jew. It was just another way to denigrate us and to isolate us and to set us apart from the rest of society. This represents the Star of David, a beautiful, meaningful Jewish symbol. But the Nazis made it so very ugly. Each of us, each and every one of us must do everything in our power to prevent such hatred, such destruction, and such terror from reoccurring. And we can begin by having love, respect, and tolerance towards one another, regardless of the religious belief, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of the national origin. This respect towards one another must begin in our homes, around the kitchen table, the dining room table, wherever we gather as a family. We, the adults, must pass it on our places of business. You, the students, in your classrooms, in the halls of your schools, communities, towns, cities, and only if there's respect and tolerance towards one another in the countries can we expect to have peace in the world. We must begin with our children. Let us treat people as individuals. Let us look for similarities and respect the differences. Let us build bridges and reach out to one another. And we must be true to ourselves and not blindly follow a leader without thinking ahead and searching our hearts and our minds as to what the consequences might be. As I tell the students, it is not cool to follow just anyone's lead without first checking to see what his or her true intentions are. Please, please, let us all remember these messages. Let us all live by these messages. We're all aware, or we should be, that 6 million Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust of the Second World War. Your beautiful state of West Virginia has a population of just under 2 million. Can you possibly imagine 3 times the population of West Virginia wiped out? The 6 million also represents 1/3 of the entire pre-World War II Jewish population. Among them were 1.5 million children, just like the children are here this evening. We also need to remember that there were 5 million non-Jews who lost their lives. Among them were the righteous Gentiles, as we refer to them. Very special people, non-Jews who jeopardized their lives to save Jewish families. They would hide them in their attics. They would hide them in the basement. Farmers would hide them out in the barns. They were hidden in convents. And when these good people were caught doing what they felt was the right thing to do, they also were deported to concentration camps and in many cases lost their lives. And that brings me to another message. We must never generalize and judge an entire group by the actions of some within that group. These are all universal messages, messages that each and every one of us is familiar with to varying degrees, but need to be reminded of over and over again. And this certainly was a good opportunity to do so. These messages are the lessons learned from that dark period of our history, and certainly apply to today's world situation and definitely to our own individual lives. By listening, I hope that our young people prevent their past, prevent their life from, that our young people prevent our past from becoming their future. The fact that you're all here this evening, and you didn't have to be here. This afternoon, I spoke with several that didn't have to be there either at the university. But in the morning, I was at Hamilton Middle School, and yesterday at Belpre, and then we were at Jackson, and these students had no choice but to be there. But you didn't have to be here this evening. And with that in mind, I would like to share the following quote with you. A quote by the British statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Please, please stay involved.